everybody, and welcome to the last set of lectures. So this series is going to end up being about gender and war in India's Northeast, but I guess by now you know the drill. First I'm going to talk a little bit about gender and combat in general. And first I will figure out how to do this. I'm using a new version of Kaltura and having some challenges. There we go. Okay. Okay, gender and combat. So, again, so much of the material in this last third of the class has to do with whether one thinks that gender difference is something that is inherent, that is given to us by nature, or whether it's something that is learned, right? And so how you feel about women and or LGBT in combat probably has to do with your perspective on whether there is an innate psychological difference between men and women or whether there's not. Right, so just as a refresher, for liberal feminists, they tend to downplay any sort of essentialist difference between men and women, and basically the concern of liberal feminists is that women should have equal access, equal opportunities, right? So from a liberal feminist perspective, women should be able to play the same roles that men do in war or in combat. There are a variety of different strains of radical feminism, but some of the versions of radical feminism do emphasize an innate difference between men and women, right? And they would say that women are gentler and kinder and all that. Others would say that why on earth would women want to have any part in the vicious slaughtering behavior that men perpetrate in war? So personally, when I do this lecture, I feel a bit torn. Because on the one hand, I do want to appreciate the accomplishments of women in LGBT, right? Those who have been the first or among the first to, be head of a platoon or whatever. But then on the other hand, I do have some reservations about militarism. So I'll let you flesh that out for yourselves as we go along. Okay, so first, LGBTQ and combat, and yes, this is not something that is in the book that I assigned, right? She Goes to War was written by a woman who was in her 70s, was a journalist in the 1970s. So obviously she's an elderly lady, right? So I don't think LGBTQ is just really even on her radar, unfortunately. But obviously this has been an issue in the U.S. and many other places in the world. So in terms of gays in the military, this map shows in blue the countries that have a confirmed inclusion policy for LGBT people in the military, or whether there's evidence that suggests such inclusion is likely. And I probably should unpack the T part, right? Because there are countries that are okay with the LGB but have an issue with the T in the military. So you can see that there are actually not really all that many countries in the world that do have a gay-friendly military policy. And again, these tend to be the wealthier countries, right? So advanced industrialized countries plus a lot of South American countries, especially the more well-to-do ones. So basically the richer countries minus the Muslim Middle East. So in India, remember they decriminalized homosexuality fairly recently. However, the ban on homosexuals in the army still holds. And this is something that, they've tried to change after the laws, the sodomy laws were revoked. But the army said no, adultery and homosexuality, and they conflated the two, of course, are unbecoming conduct. And so no homosexuals in the military. I don't know I don't know if they're going to ban adulterers, but in any case. So in the military in India, even today, homosexual acts will put you in jail for up to 10 years. So in the USA, for most of my life, there was a ban on LGBT in the military. And every year, people got kicked out. Between 1980 and 1990, about 1,500 gays, lesbians, bisexuals, probably some trans as well, were kicked out of the military on the basis of their sexual orientation, and it was not an honorable discharge. So in 1993, it was considered something really progressive when Clinton enacted the don't ask, don't tell policy, although to us now it may seem hideously regressive, right? So this policy said that the openly LGBTQ could not serve in the military, in the U.S. military. However, if you remained in the closet, you couldn't be harassed on the basis of your sexual orientation. So this was, of course, oops. All right, so this slide got in the wrong place. Israeli exceptionalism, right? You can see that since 1993, Israel permitted gays to serve openly in the defense forces, and so this was quite unusual. But 1993, we were initiating Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So in 2016, there was something of a transgender spring, that's my word, in which the ban on the trans people in the military was lifted. And so this mostly applied to trans people who were already secretly in the military. And it was in part because of a number of them coming out and saying, oh, you know what, I was actually born XYZ, right? So the first trans recruits entered the military in January 2018. But, as you're probably aware, this was rapidly followed by what I'm calling a transgender winter. Right? In mid-2017, President Trump tweeted that the transgender people could not serve in the military in any capacity. And then he set people about to implementing this policy. So there are many legal challenges to this ban, and the legal challenges are ongoing. However, the Supreme Court has ruled that the ban on transgenders people in the military can hold, that they can be banned while these legal challenges go on. So basically what this means is that nobody who is open about being trans can join, and nobody who is already in the military can change gender. But those transgender people who are already in the military are not automatically kicked out while the various lawsuits work their way through the courts. And of course, the reason that was given was that it's too expensive to have trans troops because their gender reassignment surgeries would cost too much. So there are about 20 countries in the world that do give transgender people equal access to the military. And again, these are mostly the advanced industrialized Western countries. Two interesting exceptions are Bolivia and Thailand, pictured here. So in Thailand, if you were born male, when you turn 21, you have to show up for military conscription. And it doesn't matter if you identify as female, right? You still have to show up. So the people born male who show up as female at age 21 are examined, which is, of course, quite intimidating. They're examined to see if they are, in fact, transitioning or have transitioned. And if the medical examiner deems that they are, in fact, transitioning to female, then they can be exempted. But this is extremely stressful for male to female transgenders in Thailand. Okay, so some of the arguments against transgender serving in the military include the infamous unit cohesion, right? I used to hear that a lot when I was your age. And that's basically the idea that the boys won't get along if one of them is trans, right? Or, basically that there'll be love affairs when people's minds should be on business, etc. The too expensive argument, general disapproval of LGBTQ, stereotypes of effeminate gay or bi men. And I do recall when I was working in DC in the early 90s, hearing a woman say that, well, of course gay men should be in the military. And I was a little surprised because I didn't think she was the sort to say that. And she said, well, who else would cut the hair and do the flowers? Right. So, basically that's relying on stereotypes that gay or bi men are, basically interior decorators and hairstylists, and that the idea of them serving in combat would be ridiculous, right? Of course, homosexuality or gender fluidity, gender dysphoria, whatever you want to call it, was considered a mental illness until recent decades, right? And so any sort of mental illness would disqualify you from the military service. The blackmail argument was used for much of my life, and that's the idea that you couldn't have a LGBTQ soldier because it would be too easy for them to be blackmailed, right? So the enemy could say, hey, we're going to tell everybody about your trips to the gay bar unless you give us information about plans. And of course, this assumes that everybody wants to stay in the closet, right? So if you're LGBTQ and serving openly, I don't really see the point of the blackmail argument. And you can probably come up with other arguments against transgender people in the military. This is just what I could rattle off from the top of my head. Okay, so moving on to women in combat. Oh, and I should have mentioned, of course, that today, of course, you can be openly LGB in the military, right? But whether you can be openly T is still to be resolved. So women in combat, and as I'd mentioned in the first part of this third of the course, this is nothing new, right? I mean, since ancient times, women have been in combat, but you wouldn't know that from some of the discussion in U.S. policy circles in recent years. So in India, which you're reading about, women are still excluded from ground combat roles in the Indian Army. And if you've read through much of She Goes to War, you'll see how ironic this is because, hey, those guerrilla women were definitely doing ground combat. But the arguments that were given, and yes, this is 2020, the arguments that are given by Indian commanders as to why they don't have women in ground combat roles are, first of all, that men are not ready to accept them. And secondly, the pressures of motherhood and childcare upon female soldiers. Right, so there are women pilots in India's Navy and Air Force who could be in combat. And before long, the first women in the Navy are being trained for combat in India's Navy. But not surprisingly, India's Army is only 4% women. So a very small percentage. Okay, so some of the arguments against women in combat, and, when I was growing up, again, this was seen as just basically common sense. I mean, why would you send women into war? So women are seen as the weaker sex, right? I've heard men say that having women in the Army is a disadvantage, right? It makes your Army vulnerable. People say that the armies will water down standards in order to permit women to join, right? Others use the argument that women are psychologically unfit, right? And so some of these are overtly sexist, such as women are too emotional. What if women are PMSing, right? But some of them are a little bit more sophisticated, right? So some would just say, well, women are more gentle, women are more interconnected, blah, blah, blah. Women are not as good, hard, cold killers, right? A sociobiological argument is that because at this time women are the ones who are able to produce babies or, nurture babies for 9 months until they arrive on this planet, that women are better suited for making more soldiers, right? So from this perspective, it's not really about whether women could or couldn't fight. It's just basically that, from a biological standpoint, it would make more sense to get rid of the men in war because men are disposable one man can sire goodness knows how many babies, but a woman's womb is occupied for 9 months, right? There's also the unit cohesion argument, and the very real argument that having women soldiers puts them in danger of sexual violence, right? So not only if they're caught by the enemy, but as we've seen, puts them in danger of sexual violence by the men in their own ranks, right? And particularly their trainers. So we know that in different armies at different times and different places, women serve different roles, right? So there's no formula. And so what one can do is ask, what are the results for the women, right? And of course here we have World War II era women who are thrilled to serve their country, but hey, now they need codex, right? These actually are pretty funny. You can Google it and find them yourselves, but they have all sorts of hints for those days during the war, right? What are the results for the units? What are the results for the country? What are the results for the world? And of course, the U.S. has a long history of women in war. It's simply that up until recent decades, women were not in combatant roles, right? So I think the closest thing to combatant that women served for most of U.S. history was home defense, right? And this is fairly common. I mean, a home defense is or like a national reserve type thing. That's basically, if all the men have been gunned down, then you have a line of women to take their place, basically. But these women, of course, would not have been in combatant roles. But most of the roles in the military are actually not combatant. So it is a truism that warfare has changed, certainly over the last century, right? And I'm sure you've learned about how World War I was a big change in the way wars were fought, right? But the anti-colonial wars, such as Vietnam War, many of the other wars of the late 20th century, involved guerrilla warfare. And then as we've moved into the 21st century, we find more aerial warfare, we find more drones, we find more warfare that we would probably call terrorism, etc. So my point here is that it's pretty rare that you actually have hand-to-hand combat anymore, or at least not in the advanced industrialized world, right? So in the old days, it was said basically that, war was a men's thing because on average, men tend to be bigger and stronger than women are. These days, though, both women and men can drop bombs and manipulate drones, right? So as the nature of warfare has changed, so too has women's roles in warfare. Now, the book I used to assign, Joshua Goldstein's book on gender and war, spoke of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in the early 1990s, as a victory for liberal feminism. And there were over 40,000 U.S. women deployed in this war from the various wings of the U.S. military. So, since you didn't read the book, I guess I'll answer my rhetorical question here, and that is, there were a lot of firsts, right? A lot women proved that they could hold up and do the jobs that men did, or even jobs that few men were skilled enough to do. And that they could do them well and just fine, right? So that's why liberal feminists would see it as a victory, right? And I'm asking here, were the wars in Afghanistan and the Second Gulf War also victories for liberal feminism? And I haven't seen the stats on the racial ethnic identity of the women who were killed in these wars. I do know that over 100 women were killed. But from the pictures that I was looking at, very few of them seem to be white women, right? In terms of the fatalities. I don't know what that tells us. But the Pentagon, during most of this time, the Pentagon prohibited women from being assigned to a frontline combat unit. However, the Iraq War was considered an insurgency without a front line, and as somebody who's been through one war, although I was not a combatant by any means, I was in the war in the former Yugoslavia in mid-1990s, and I can tell you that in war today, there's not always a front line. I mean, it's not like the old days where the army approaches and the army retreats, right? On foot, you could end up in the front line even if you're, well, as in the case of Shoshana Johnson. I think she was, yeah, Shoshana Johnson, I believe, was a cook. She was supposed to be a cook in the army, but her unit ended up being captured, and that's why she became the first African-American female prisoner of war. So, women have been in combat even when they've been in positions in which, they weren't supposed to see combat. So, an ongoing issue has been the difficulties that women have in going through military academies, military training, and then once they're actually serving in their units. Right, so an issue that I'm not going to try to attempt to answer here is whether military academies and military units should be segregated by sex. There are arguments for and arguments against, but the data is clear in terms of the U.S. that women in the U.S. military face a horrific rate of sexual harassment and even sexual violence, right? So the climate definitely needs to be made more favorable to women. 2016 saw the first women integrated formally into combat units, and so there are now several dozen female Army Rangers, including these pictured here. So the United States joins about a dozen countries that permit women to have frontline combat roles. And these are mostly cold places where white people mostly live, right? So Western Europe, Northern Europe, Canada, and then New Zealand and Australia. So one of the last issues I'll discuss here has to do with the draft or military conscription, right? And as you're probably aware, recently a U.S. court ruled that the male-only draft, the selective service, is unconstitutional. Right? So basically that girls should have to register for the draft just like boys. And obviously this is controversial, right? There are a lot of people who are not keen on this idea. So there actually are not that many countries that draft women. And this map is actually, the green means that they have a draft of males, right? So you can see that it's actually only about a third of the countries in the world that even have a military draft. Yellow are those countries that apply the military draft to women as well as men. And you can see there are not very many of them, 11, and so there may be one or two more since 2019. Eritrea and Israel are two countries that have drafted women for some time. I do teach an entire class on women in war, and I go into these countries in detail. But Israel only put women in combat fairly recently. It's only been within the last few years that women have been put in combat units. Although, of course, with the changing nature of warfare, Israeli women have seen combat for some time. It's just they weren't supposed to. Eritrea is a fascinating story in which women comprised a third of the Liberation Army back in the late 20th century. And so they routinely use women in combat. So in Sudan and Vietnam, they say that they draft both men and women, but in practice, they don't actually draft women. So women can join, but they don't really force women to join. So here are 4 countries that say that they will draft women if they ever institute a draft, and draft women in addition to men. So in terms of liberal feminism, right, they would probably say that a military draft would be a good thing, right? A military draft for women because, they'd say it's basically about equality of opportunity. And so many political roles are, let me rephrase that, so many political leaders have a military background that typically women have been disadvantaged in these because, they don't have their old status as a general, to flaunt when they run for president or whatnot. So this is slowly changing, right, as more and more women have military experience. Again, radical feminism, there are different strains of it, but basically radical feminists tend to want to either interrogate or in some cases even entirely dismantle masculinist militarism. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the organization Code Pink in the US, but it's I would call it a radical feminist peace group. And you can see as one of their slogans is feminism, not militarism, stop killer drones, right? So arms are for hugging, right? So they would be very suspicious of this, why on earth would you want women to be just as violent and aggressive and militaristic as men? Line of thinking. And thus ends this part of the lecture.